This is a Mossad Files video special. I'm Dan Raviv. I'm very pleased to be speaking with John Spencer, who is an expert on war, which is very important when it comes to everything going on in the world and also our special focus on the Mossad Files, that is to say, the use of intelligence. John Spencer, you are chair of war studies at the Madison, help me with the rest, John?
Policy Forum.
At the Madison Policy Forum. We've seen you on a lot of media, but I'm hoping for a discussion here that focuses on your view of the Gaza war, of Israel's behavior, if you will, and strategy and execution and level of success, because most people are saying, John, the war is over. President Trump cut a deal. All the living hostages were released by Hamas. Israel released about 2,000 Hamas and Palestinian prisoners that Israel was holding. But is the war over as we're speaking now, right? There's still flare-ups, there's violence, and Hamas has not given up its weapons. So can we start there? Is the Gaza war over?
So you think it's a simple question, but somebody who taught strategy at West Point, created a research center at West Point, I know that that's not an easy question. Although wars do have a start point and an end point. In Operation Swords of Iron, which is Israel's operation in response to the October 7th Hamas invasion, had three clear goals, and that would be the goals that you would measure war start, ending, and success, in my opinion. So
Mhm.
Israel has ended Operation Irons of the Sword, renamed the operation, which is in war normal as well, that you see a transition points as the war enters different phases. Like you said, Hamas is still an organization. And if you know the three goals of the war, right? Return the hostages, destroy Hamas as a military political organization, and ensure that no threat comes from Gaza. Again, clearly, if you take those three goals, that's not going to happen quickly. Hamas doesn't have a military as we're speaking. There's only four hostages, dead hostages, unfortunately, left in Gaza. But this 20-point peace plan pretty much relegates Hamas as it ends Hamas, the 20-point peace plan. And war is political. So from a political military analysis, you can say the war has transitioned out of its high intensity phase into really the second and third order effect, which is really important to ensure that Hamas never gains power again, doesn't build another military, and that the situation and the path towards peace is going forward. But we like to do this in historical studies. Like, when did World War II end? Did it end on VE Day? When did it end? Versus the work that was done to ensure that the peace was maintained.
Wow. I mean, I think that war, World War II, ended when Germany surrendered. There was a senior officer who signed a deal. And of course, we know on the USS Missouri, right, there was the end of the war between the Allies, led by the US, and Japan. But this time we knew that no one from Hamas would ever show up at a meeting with Israelis and sign a surrender. So we didn't expect that. So let's just go back again briefly to your measures, because if one of them is that Hamas can never again rule the Gaza Strip, I'm concerned that where they hold perhaps as much as 47% of the Gaza Strip, maybe they're ruling there and still enforcing their might. Hamas is not gone.
It's a good, it's it's a good question, good point. But like you said, this is the really the historic nature of the 20-point peace plan is that Hamas was a part of the conversation, did agree to basically ending their political and military control. While over the 2 years, we saw them trying different mechanisms to include take what we call the Hezbollah model, which is say they're going to give up political power to some technocratic authority, but then maintain military power, which is the Hezbollah model in Lebanon. Even though it does have political leaders on the actual Lebanese government. But the fact that they agreed to the 20-point plan, war is always a contest of wills, both sides trying to basically achieve a goal. I would say, and we have to look at historically, we'll look back as the 20-point peace plan in all the countries that signed the paper as an ending of the war, but not fighting. This really gets to okay, who is Hamas? Is Hamas the political wing leadership in Qatar? Is it the what is left? Because the Hamas of October 7th in Gaza doesn't exist anymore. The entire leadership hierarchy, every actual commander in both the political and military wing is pretty much dead. So, but it is a idea. It is an organization, political and military. So there are still lots of radicalized people who are continuing to fight. But really, from a war is political. I would say, I mean, I'm not. You're not going to get me on record of saying the war is over. As we have so much more fighting. Even the distinction you made about the what has been kind of an implementation strategy for the initial steps of the yellow line, 53% Israel controls. And then I guess you could say Hamas controls the other areas, even though they agreed to this plan, which is there is no Hamas anymore. They will have no role, political and military, in this strip. But it's just biting it off incrementally. I don't think that there's nothing in the 20-point plan that even discusses the yellow line. That Hamas will have that control over there for any amount of time. It's just what's being implemented as you have to take this step by step and progressively. I don't think that yes, temporarily facts on the ground. Nobody else but Hamas is controlling, although the clans were contesting power against Hamas in those regions. But then you talk about the stabilization force, where Israel can maneuver within the kind of agreement with freedom of maneuver in their 53%, where there's still Hamas, to be clear, and there's still fighting that has to happen in order to demilitarize and implement the 20-point plan. So there's some nuances here. War definitely transitioned, and there's a clear goal to what does it look like to keep Hamas from regaining power and military capabilities.
Okay, now you've been there on the scene, right? You're not just analyzing from your desk, whether at West Point or at the Madison Center, right? You have gone, was it 4 times, 5 times? And of course, that meant being with the Israeli side. That was the only practical way to visit the war itself, right?
7 visits to Israel since October 7th, 6 embedded with the IDF inside of Gaza, conducting my own research. I'm not a reporter, I'm a war researcher. So I'm going in for a very specific reason. And yes, it was usually with it was with the IDF, of course, analyzing their tactics, techniques, procedures, the war goals, the progress across those 7 visits.
Now, I had the impression, John, at least from your public appearances, which began pretty early in the war. Again, the war began, as we said, October 7th, 2023, with a vicious attack by Hamas crossing the border. Israel's defenses seemed almost non-existent that day, and so there were massacres and kidnappings. More than 250 people kidnapped into Gaza by Hamas. That phase, the kidnappings, almost over. As we've discussed, not everything about it is over. But I had the impression from your earliest visits that you were siding with Israel, which may be only natural because what had occurred were terrorist attacks, massacres, and kidnappings, right, against a country that's allied with the United States. Are you willing to accept that? In this conflict, you were on Israel's side.
No, I'm not willing to accept that. I'm a researcher, and I have written over 67 articles or reports, hundreds of interviews. I would say I'm on the side of truth. I do believe I have a moral code, a morality aspects of that. While I have been accused of having bias in my analysis, I do factor in everything that Hamas leadership says and does to include my observations of what they do in human shielding and human sacrifice inside of Gaza. I can see why people would say that I'm on Israel's side. I'm actually on the side of truth, and there's been a complete inversion of that. And even the earliest days, writing in October, November, I was writing against the misinformation that was immediate about the laws of war, the military context, even what had happened on October 7th. And I've been vigorous about that because I think it really matters. So I don't accept that as whose side I am. I do believe in good and evil. And October 7th, and I wrote this in a Time magazine article, as somebody who studies war today around the world in many locations, what Hamas is and what it did is a special type of evil ever since October 7th. Not just on that day, even though that was a unique type of barbarism that I've never seen in my 30, 40 plus years of military study and practitioner. I'm on the side of truth. I mean, that's why I went so many times to analyze What was the IDF doing? What were the challenges? How were they addressing the challenges? How were they protecting civilians, despite the all of the things that are happening in Gaza that are unique really in history to Israel, but also the uniqueness of this weird Israeli standard that Israel has to follow in war, and then the misinformation that comes out of that.
All right. Let me be clear, by the way. In no way was I accusing you of being biased toward Israel against the Palestinians. You see, that's my point. I don't think Hamas represents the Palestinian people. I've been covering the Middle East for nearly 50 years, including ups and downs and peace processes and progress and terrorist attacks. This is not the Palestinian people. It could well be, there's no reliable poll, that most people in Gaza did support the Hamas dictators, maybe. And then once the massacres occurred, maybe at first that sounded terrific to a lot of people in Gaza. Again, we don't have opinion polls. But now that there's been so much damage, right, it's not for you to blame unless you want to come in on this as who destroyed Gaza, right? My friends who are clearly pro-Israel say it's Hamas's fault, right? You're going to do something like attack a strong and sophisticated nation such as Israel. Obviously, Israel's going to hit back and hit back hard. I guess your study was how did the IDF deal with a terrorist government regime in Gaza that was hiding behind civilians, that had tunnels and military facilities under hospitals, right? There's no doubt about that Hamas was hiding, if you will, in tunnels and civilian facilities and mosques, and didn't allow the Gaza people to enjoy bomb shelters or anything like that.
I mean, that's an objective fact. Although you can't say it's not debated, even though it's an objective fact. Again, this is why, yes, I am definitely anti-terrorist holistically from at my core. The targeting of civilians to instill fear and achieve political goals, but Hamas, again, a special type of even terrorist, the Hamas military, you're right, what it designed in Gaza, it wasn't just that. And I think this is where people, I mean, Hamas is different than even ISIS or the most vicious political organization or terror organization you can think of. And the human sacrifice strategy that I seen with my own eyes, like you said, it's not just using all the protected sites, what we call lawfare, the hospitals, the schools, the mosques, the UN facilities, and hiding in those, but it's also the 600 plus miles of tunnels that Hamas divested or diverted in billions of dollars of aid sent to the Palestinian people in Gaza and created this underground world for the sole purpose, not just to hide in, but to use the civilians on the surface because no civilians are allowed in their tunnels as a shield and sacrifice to achieve their political goal, according to them, not according to John Spencer, according to their leadership as of just a few weeks ago. That was their strategy, which is very unique in warfare studies. And I try to get people to understand that. It isn't about they're just trying to survive. They're actually trying to get civilians killed and have done so many evil things against their own population. That is ahistorical. No other war that I've ever studied is that the goal of the political and military apparatus is to sacrifice all of their civilians to achieve not just the information operations kind of victory, but the true political victory in the war.
Well, there are some supporters of the Palestinian cause who say they tried everything else. Right? People who think that the Palestinians deserved a state, and those people often accuse, right? You don't have to get into the political history. They accuse Israel of not allowing the Palestinians to have a country. Of course, Israelis respond that there were so many chances, Bill Clinton efforts and others. Um, and there was hope, and then Arafat walked away. Got that. That's the political side, if you will. But having tried everything, now, even the Palestinians of Gaza voted for Hamas after the Israelis left the Gaza Strip in 2005. And the next year there was an election, and Hamas then chased away and killed a lot of the Al Fatah people. And the Gaza people knew they were going for radicalism. They were proud of suicide bombers. It was their only way to be kind of revolutionary and beat the much more powerful Israelis. So, as a war analyst, you say that's a unique methodology, right? To be a self described, downtrodden, oppressed people and you become their leader, Hamas in Gaza, and say we've tried everything else, we've tried peace, Arafat was wrong, etc., we're just going to have to go on our mission of blood, suicide bombings, constant opposition to Israel, and then again, October 7th, an ambitious plan to kill as many Israelis as possible and shock the powerful state of Israel. Again, as a war goal, I guess that's unique. It was never going to work. I mean, to me, it seems obvious. Israel's unbelievably more powerful. The result was going to be death and destruction in Gaza.
Yeah, there's a lot there. To
Take it,
include the
John.
hypocrisy of poor populations. When Arafat was one of the richest people in the world during his time, the Hamas leadership in Qatar are billionaires. The Hamas leadership in Gaza are millionaires. But the food insecurity that happened in Gaza was long before the operations after October 7th. So you have 90+% of the people below the level of poverty struggle to have access to potable water and food, and they're taught that it's Israel's fault while their leadership are billionaires. Separate than that, the actual execution of the war, right? This is where there is no moral relevancy, and I faced this a lot since October 7th of, yes, Hamas did on October 7th this bad, but look at the destruction that Israel is doing in Gaza, which is all loaded. But actually, in centuries of war, there's just war theory. Like there's a just war for going to war. And sure, if you want to argue, which is not true, it's not, people can have their own opinions, they can't have their own facts about. And I've been studying Israel for years, probably not as many as you, but for a long time. In the so-called open-air prison, so-called blockade, so-called occupation, all those loaded political terms. But then you have the reality on the ground. Just war theory, there's you have to have a just reason to go to war, but then there's just execution of the war, which is why I'm such an advocate for the laws of war, which were, they're evolved over a very long time, over a century, to put limits on the brutality of war so that the civilians and the infrastructure don't pay the price of the belligerents of whatever war for whatever reason. And this is again where October 7th, there is no justification. Doesn't matter what for what Hamas did in the raping, the murdering, the burning, the taking of men, women, and children hostage. There is no excuse that anybody can give. It doesn't matter if you, which usually they don't know the context in war studies, like for starting a war and the execution of the war. Again, this goes into the comparative analysis of what anybody's ever done before. But the fact that I believe in the construct of nation states as well, and of course Israel has the right to defend itself after being attacked, and then the way it does matter. And this is again my analysis was how was Israel taking on the actions of responding to attack Article 51 of the United Nations Self-Defense Act, and then justly executing that and following the laws of armed conflict and trying to prevent harm to civilians. And this is the really the inversion of truth of what Hamas did on October 7th. Even the rockets are war crimes. In the opening days of October 7th, Hamas, in the opening hour, launched over 4,000 rockets. Every one of them are not guided. So they're just lobbed at civilian cities. They're all war crimes.
And
There
of
is
course, Hamas and its partners in Palestinian Islamic Jihad have done that for some 20 years.
yep,
So that's your view of the unguided missiles. All right, let's
yep.
let's let's be sure to get therefore to your conclusions. Tell me, John, if they are interim conclusions about the Israeli behavior. Israel then has the upper hand once it decides to go into Gaza in the sense of being far more powerful and organized military, commanders, political decisions, Prime Minister Netanyahu, behind them, giving orders to strike this or that or go after the leaders. So is it just an interim conclusion of yours? How did Israel, its forces, behave in Gaza? What's your conclusion?
So my conclusion, based on those 7 visits, to include embedding with, I mean, across the formation. I've interviewed everybody from the prime minister, two chiefs of staff, division commanders, battalion, all the way down to individual soldiers on the ground. Israel has implemented its operations after October 7th in accordance with the law of armed conflict and above and beyond that. They've done more to prevent civilian harm, what we call civilian harm control measures, than in any military in the history of war. They've done more to feed the enemy's population who controls enemy areas, holds their hostages, than any military in the history of war. their execution. Of course, there are events that soldiers have made mistakes or done wrong things, like every war in history. But writ large, in finding Israel has followed the law of armed conflict, all the laws of war, and done more than legal requirements because there is always a balance between military goals and the humanitarian imperative, like Israel stopping this war so many times to do things like vaccinate the entire population of Gaza, to feed the population, to provide water, electricity, everything. There's these two balances of these deconflictions, but Israel and the IDF have implemented this war with full accordance with legal, moral, and ethical standards.
Wow. You certainly then reject the accusation that the protesters in the streets here in America and in other Western countries are carrying their signs and chanting their slogans that Israel was committing genocide, where again, the official legal definition includes the intent to wipe out all or part of the Palestinian people. You just don't see that. And you were really up
I,
close in this war.
I've written it. I've written many that I think it's an assault on critical thinking. It's an inversion of the truth on all that Israel has done that isn't required by any standard to protect, feed, vaccinate, hospitalize, provide hospital services to the population. If they were trying to commit genocide, they're the worst organization to ever attempt it in the history of the world. I mean, it's just an assault on critical thinking, and an inversion of the truth, despite all the evidence and literally mountains of evidence that I've seen in Gaza that Israel is trying to help civilians, not to eliminate civilians.
I believe you spent time with Israeli forces in Gaza, even in the final days of the war, right? As President Trump and his envoys were arranging the deal, you were with Israeli troops. Did they feel victorious? Was there some mopping up they wanted to do, as truce hour was approaching? I mean, what sort of things did you hear from the soldiers on the ground?
Sure. Yeah, and I was actually in Gaza City with an IDF unit hours before the full peace agreement was made public and agreed to and everything. The units were with were focused on active combat, the building shaking from tank fire, fighting Hamas that were still fighting and trying to kill the IDF. Shortly when I got back to Israel proper, though, when the news broke, it was just euphoria and relief. Not that everything was over, that there was an agreement, the hostages were coming home, and then days later for the living hostages, although Hamas immediately started violating everything that they said they were going to do. There was an appreciation with the IDF also about there's still a lot of work to be done, but just a sense of relief could be felt in the entire nation as I was making my way from the airport to the taxi to the actual soldiers, a relief that the hostages were coming home, which was it's so embedded in the culture of Israel to return their hostages.
Right. Okay. So the nation celebrated. You're perceiving that the IDF personnel were also happy. Hostages are being released, but they knew there was more work to do. Okay, got you there. Whether it was in the final weeks or frankly on, in all your 7 visits, there must have been there must have been occurrences you saw in which some of the Israeli soldiers and maybe the online commanders were acting out of anger because of what Hamas had done to Israel. It's only natural and human to act out of anger rather than just being disciplined and thinking about your next move as a military unit. So just speak to that, please.
Sure. Yeah, I actually never, in my 7 visits and hundreds of interviews across the entire IDF chain of command, ran into, not saying they're not there, anybody who is acting out of anger. And as a veteran myself who jumped into northern Iraq after in 2003, shortly after 9/11, people thought we were in for whatever reasons. I never got that from the IDF professional force. And this gets to the proximity of the threat that most people, again, don't acknowledge. If you have ever been to Israel, have been to the southern Israel along the Gaza envelope, and you can see 2 football fields away from like Far Aza or the villages that Hamas attacked. And that's where the people that want to eradicate you say live and are in that proximity. So every IDF commander or soldier I met knew why they were fighting to bring the hostages home, but also to protect their family as they could watch rockets going over their head towards their homes. And I don't think most people acknowledge that proximity to that threat. This isn't a war thousands of miles away, even if it's for national security reasons. This is a real threat to their survival that people have tried to discount. As I was even with IDF soldiers, as rockets were headed towards Tel Aviv during my few visits. So I didn't get anger, vengeance, justice from them. I got caring for bringing hostages that they likely knew because of just there's no 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon. There's 1 degree to an IDF soldier or a hostage. They were fighting and they knew why they were fighting. And that's what I got. Of course, there have been soldiers who have acted up. Some have been brought to actual military courts. And that's a part of a professional military as well. It polices and has a criminal justice system on top of all other legal justice systems.
That's John Spencer. I thank you so much for spending your time with us. You're head of war studies for the Madison Policy Forum. We look forward to seeing you more often, even as you continue to study what you told me was a war that's not entirely over. John Spencer, thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan.
And just a brief word about my books that you can buy. Both of them I'm about to mention, co-authored with Yossi Melman, an Israeli expert on intelligence and strategy. There it is, Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars. It's a history of the Mossad and the other intelligence agencies, Spies Against Armageddon. And Yossi Melman and I also have a new book, an ebook only, called Target Iran, telling how the Mossad managed to infiltrate Iran and had so many active spies inside Iran. And frankly, they still do. Thanks again to John Spencer. And please remember to listen to the Mossad Files, the weekly audio podcast. Thanks, I'm Dan.